hello everyone. Welcome to the SOLA Network. My name is Kevin Yee, and I serve on the Editorial board. The last year has seen a massive rise in anti-Asian hate crimes across the United States, and last week's Atlanta massacre has driven us to lament and prayer. But as Asian Americans, is there more that we should be doing? Our guests today are Chang and Missio Reyes of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and they have been spearheading rallies all across the country to stand for AAPI lives this coming Sunday, March 28th. Just by way of introduction, Pastor Chang is the president of AACC. He's a pastor and writer. He regularly preaches God's word and speaks throughout the country on issues pertaining to Christianity and culture, race, and faith. He's currently living in the Chicago area, serving as a campus minister at Wheaton College, and is currently pursuing his PhD. Michelle Reyes, PhD, is the vice president of the AACC and co-executive director of Pax. She's also the scholar in residence at Hope Community Church. Michelle's work on faith and culture has been featured in Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Missio Alliance, Faithfully Magazine, and more. She has a book coming out on cross-cultural relationships that's called Becoming All Things, How Small Changes Lead to Lasting Connections Across Cultures, and this launches later next month. Thank you guys so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so I just want to go ahead and get right into the questions, because I think that there's so much that's been going on, so many things that as Asian Americans we've been processing through. Personally, I've been really deeply affected by the Atlanta massacre, and this has been said over and over and over again, that it really has felt like, this could be our moms, this could be our aunts, this could be our sisters, and it's brought up a lot of very strong trauma that I think, frankly, many of us have put aside this past year with regards to some of the racism that we've experienced passively and aggressively. And so many of us as Asian Americans have been taught to kind of put our heads down. As one of my friends said it, swallow the bitterness and kind of work around the issue as opposed to dealing with it sort of straight on. And so I know that, with my ministry and my church, we've turned to prayer during a time like this. But my question to you guys is sort of what's next? What does action look like during a time like this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I feel like I could answer that in a lot of different ways, because there's a lot of different factors playing into why Christians in general, including Asian American Christians, turn to lament and prayer only. And I'm not saying that prayer and lament are bad. We should turn to prayer and lament. But, in the response to rising anti-Asian violence, and even after the Atlanta massacre, I still hear so many Christians saying we just need to focus on the gospel right now and how the gospel changes hearts. And I've heard many Asian American Christians echo the sentiment as well. And so certainly we should focus on the gospel. But too often those who make that claim have a very anemic view of the gospel that needs to be corrected. And usually that claim comes with this understanding of the gospel being purely understood in spiritual terms, to the detriment of all else, right? And, as Michael Emerson and Christian Smith argue in their book, Divided by Faith, North American Christians often see their faith as something that's hyper-individual. And so we're focusing in on our own, how are we processing the world? And so when a community is ravaged by injustice, we reduce the priority of the body of Christ to getting individuals right with God. We just say, let's focus on salvation and getting people to believe in Jesus. And then if people believe in Jesus, things like racism won't exist anymore. Things like, racial violence won't exist anymore. And, the problem with that stance is that we're taking into no consideration into the physical and social well-being of a person. And after a person believes in Jesus, we just sort of leave them on their own. Issues like racial trauma, unjust zoning laws, poverty, homelessness, systemic injustice, they're not our problem, right? It's not important to the gospel message. And even worse, we've come to believe that actions like standing in solidarity with the marginalized, pursuing civic engagement, raising our voices against unjust policies and systems are relegated to worldly versions of social justice. So what do we need to do after lament and prayer? we need Christians, and that includes Asian American Christians, to pursue holistic restoration for all of their neighbors. And to do this, we have to embrace a robust understanding of the term justice. And what I mean by that here is restorative justice, or social righteousness, as some people say. The phrase restorative justice is the pursuit of gospel-centered restoration. We see this in the Gospels with Jesus. Take Mark 1, for example. He enters the scene of human history and he begins saving people holistically, spiritually, certainly, but physically, socially, emotionally, and more. And so Jesus comes and declares that all people have the right to be restored back into society, and he restores people fully, holistically. So when we talk about what does the gospel require of us, or what does the gospel compel us to do in the wake of the Atlanta massacre, we have to be thinking about this sort of robust understanding of restoration. So after prayer, we have to seek to restore relationships between God and humanity, certainly. We have to seek to restore relationships between humans, and we have to restore relationships between humans and our surroundings, which includes both the environment and nature, but also systems. So the gospel compels us to do all of that.
I don't know if I have much to add, but if I did, I think piggybacking on what Michelle says, or Michelle said, I think that we just need to kind of go back to the basics of love, love of God and love of neighbor. And we need to learn how to love more deeply and learn how to be public with our love. I love what Cornel West said, right? He said, justice is what love looks like in public. Our pursuit of justice is our engagement and our practice of love. And so we need to pursue justice. And I'll take it one step further in some ways from what Michelle said. We need both restorative justice, but we need also transformative justice. We need a justice that actually changes us as individuals, changes the churches that we are a part of, that have been established on top of both racialized and sexualized frameworks and landscapes. And then we also need to practice transformation and transformative justice in the broader society, because wherever Christians are, things should be a little bit different. And a couple of ways that people could do that is by the ministry of presence, simply showing up. I think that's what we saw in the incarnation of Christ. He became present with us in everything that he did. I think that we also see that as Christ is our great advocate, that we need to learn and mirror his advocacy and his care for the marginalized and the poor, to stand up for those who are oppressed. And so engaging in the ministry of advocacy, and which will lead to the ministry of social change, because Jesus changed the world. His presence literally broke into time and wrecked the world, so that even as we look at history today, there is a BC and an AD, right? There is a before Christ, and then essentially his life, his death, and resurrection transformed the course of history. And so we need to create environments where all people are treated in accordance to their God-given dignity, and that they can all flourish. We need to seek the welfare of the city, as we see in Jeremiah.
Thank you, guys. That's a really big, I feel like, call, and a really substantial, I think, call to action. And I really appreciate that you guys are calling us to a standard that I think for a lot of us, we have a difficulty sort of receiving as our own, because I think the idea of like the perpetual foreigner, right? This idea of like, we're Americans, but we are Asian-Americans, And so what is our place in this country? What is our place in terms of seeking this restorative and transformative justice, when a lot of times our experiences don't lend itself to this idea that like, this is ours and this is something that we have to be invested in. This is something that we have, you know what I mean? And I feel like so many of us, we're being faced with that right now in a really sort of, kind of traumatizing way almost, because we're recognizing that for so long, because we haven't spoken up, because we haven't done enough to speak up for the marginalized, that we're in the position that we're in now. And so I really appreciate you guys calling us to not just something like a smaller vision for the Asian Americans, but really a really full orbed vision for what it looks like to be a part of Jesus's church, and to sort of bring that sense of justice, and that we have a part to play, you know, and it's not this compartmentalized thing, but it really is this sort of full-throated, this is what the gospel looks like. We have a place in this, and this is what we're called to. So I really, really do appreciate that. And I think for the first time, many Asian American leaders are realizing this is absolutely something that we need to get behind. So in the light of that, I would love to hear about, so you guys, working with the Asian American Christian Collaborative, how can we as Asian American leaders, especially of young adults and college students, working with our own Asian American churches, how can we partner with you guys to fully realize this vision? And to come alongside you guys and partner with you guys with regards to really aiming for and emboldening our congregations to think about this restorative and transformative justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think a part of it, you named, I think there is a sense in which there are generational divides. I think younger people are wondering what the church has to say about name an issue, and then finding that the answers that they're getting from their pastors, their churches, are really unsatisfactory, right? They're looking through the scriptures and finding that there's more in the scriptures than what their pastors are telling them. And so they're looking to other sources and other places to find answers that are adequately expressed in the scriptures and are adequately expressed in a rich kind of engagement with Christian tradition. And so I think one of the things that churches can do in part is to commit to a whole life discipleship, a whole person discipleship, right? One where it's not truncated, or one that's not beholden to kind of the political partisan idolatries that have really taken hold of many of the churches in the United States, including Asian American churches, right? I often say that the things that you can't talk about from the pulpit, show the things where you aren't allowed to bring Jesus into, And so I think there needs to be kind of an assessment of that. But when it comes to kind of partnering with us and engaging with us, I think once you have a commitment, because one of the things that I'm hearing, and I'm sure that Michelle's hearing it too, especially as we're organizing all these marches throughout the country, the more we emphasize kind of the spiritual realities of things, so like calling it a prayer rally instead of a more like a justice a justice rally, excuse me, it feels safe for Asian American Christians. But if we take God at his word, we know that he's not safe. I mean, even C.S. Lewis said he's good, but he's not safe, right? When he talks about Aslan. We have to understand that too many of our churches have become places of complacency and comfortability. They become country clubs instead of field hospitals, and spaces that really kind of shape and form people. And there are elements that are positive and powerful about that, because we're able to cultivate great communities. We're able to engage in some mercy ministries, but at the cross, we can't forget that you see both mercy and justice meet. And we have been extremely deficient when it comes to engaging with issues of justice and engaging with issues of righteousness. And so I think as churches think about how they're going to engage and how they're going to partner and how they're going to participate, that they have to have clear commitments to aspects of Christian justice or biblical justice or godly justice that will help guide them into any conversations that they have. But if you're talking about how they can partner with us specifically, I think that just by engaging with the work that we're doing, both in person and on social media, so showing up to the events that we are hosting and facilitating, including the rallies that are taking place in 13 cities as of now, which is unprecedented in the history of the Asian American Church and in the history of this country, really, where we have a coordinated effort all throughout the country doing this. And I think a part of the reason we're able to do this is because we're the Asian American Church. And one of the things I've heard consistently, especially from African American Christians who might have been somewhat skeptical even of like Asian Americans, all of us speaking up, is that we did host through AACC last year a March in Chicago for Black Lives and Dignity. And so that did lend us credibility with other communities of color to say, you know what? You're not just speaking up for yourself, you're speaking up for others too. And so as you're speaking up for yourself, we're going to join you and we're going to partner with you. And hopefully as time goes on, they're going to join us and try to speak up with us. And we're seeing that in some of the cities. In Chicago, it was a African-American woman that really said that I want to support, I want to help. What can I do to come alongside? And she's been at the core steering leadership committee of the Chicago rally, and we're just so grateful for her. I'm gonna give her a shout out. Her name is Tiana Coleman. And so, just engage with the work that we're doing, show up. The other things that you can do is kind of read the stuff that we're putting out there, because we are committed to whole life discipleship that's deeply rooted in the historic Christian faith in the global church. Listen to our podcast that we have, Reclaim. Michelle and I co-host that, and it's intended to help people round out and fill out their discipleship. So it's not just quote unquote spiritual, but it's an embodied discipleship that includes our physical actions and our hands and our feet. And then finally, write for us. I know that you should definitely write for SOLA, but write for AACC. Tell us how you're processing through things. Engage with us in ways that are helpful. But if there are churches that are listening in and say, okay, I want to do more, we are also we also welcome financial support. What we're finding is that the work that we're doing is too big for a volunteer team at this point. We have about 25 to 30 volunteers that are working hard on top of their day jobs, on top of their schooling. And so if people are interested in supporting the work that we're doing, that would be, and being regular partners, that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, and I'll just share briefly from that for anyone who doesn't, who might not be familiar with AACC. We are a multi-denominational group led by, for, and about Asian American Christians, and our mission is to equip Asian American Christians and friends of the community to follow Christ holistically. And we do this through a number of ways, as Ray mentioned, by engaging faith, race, culture, and justice from a biblical perspective. And, we just released a statement this past Monday, March 22nd, on the Atlanta massacre. And this was actually an invitation for the church to in many ways can confess its own failures to disciple. We're speaking to the North American church as a whole, but to confess its failures and discipling its congregants out of Christian nationalism that dehumanize and objectify falsehoods, as well about women and racially minoritized groups in our country. Like our statement that we put out last year in the time of COVID-19, we also called again for churches to denounce anti-Asian racism from the pulpit, and also to honor the victims by using their names instead of censoring the murderers. As Raymond mentioned, we also are calling upon the church to commit to tearing down the idols of nationalism, misogyny, and xenophobia through race and gender conscious discipleship, which includes education on Asian American issues. That's something that we have not seen done in the church, and it is time for that. And there are more calls too, but I think if you're a Christian leader, a Christian pastor listening in, take that statement, sign it, share it with your church, commit to living that out as a congregation. And if you are a congregant, take this statement, sign it, share it with your pastors, and say, hey, how can we as a church commit to these things? And if you are interested in having the AACC come alongside for any sort of mentoring or guidance or assessments, those are also things that we offer too. So if you haven't signed the statement from this last week, please do, and continue to share it.
And I just want to say we're really grateful for the friendship and the partnership of the SOLA network. I mean, many of your leaders signed the statement. They shared it, and I've been in texting conversations with several of the council members, as well as several of the pastors that are actively involved. And so it means a lot that that there is a willingness to help move the church toward the direction where we're more fully representing the kingdom of God.
Yeah, wow. Thank you guys for such a fully orbed answer. Really appreciate this idea that it's a call to discipleship. I think that really resonates with pastors. Raymond, as you mentioned, that when it's more focused on the spiritual things, there's definitely more of a willingness to jump in and dive in, because we feel like that's where we're experts. That's what we're comfortable with, right? That kind of language. But I agree with you that like there is something a bit missing when that's the only thing that we can have a conversation about, because real change isn't going to happen when we're just talking about spiritual things. There has to be action that's associated with that.
And I will add, the reason that we do that is because we've taken a page out of the white dominant playbook of the white evangelical kind of theological tradition. There are a lot of great things that came out of evangelicalism, and I consider myself an evangelical, and people are constantly asking me that, and they're asking me why am I an evangelical, because of the whiteness that's often associated with it, as well as the political idolatry that's often associated. Most Asian Americans don't actually even know what an evangelical is, because that's not the vernacular. But one of the things that most Asian American Christians don't realize is that they've been shaped and have adopted a white evangelical framework that often spiritualizes everything to the neglect of the physical, the mental, the emotional, and everything else, right? And Asian Americans, because of our theological training in these white evangelical seminaries, because of our theological heroes that are often white evangelical, and by white evangelical, I'm talking not about skin color, people who are white and evangelical. It's a commitment to whiteness that's tied to evangelicalism, right? Whiteness being associated with a racial kind of framework that keeps kind of maintains a white dominant status quo. And so the goal of whiteness is to prevent us from seeing kind of beyond the individual and actually looking at the systems and structures, which if Jesus didn't do himself, then we would have been left in our sin and hopeless, right? Because sin is a systemic issue. It pervaded the whole world. It affected the whole world. And so I think we have to understand that our influences, our theological influences, though there are good things to glean from them, are also very narrow in their understanding of the gospel and their understanding of how to engage with the world through their Christian convictions and their Christian commitments.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And it's convicting to hear that. It's also very encouraging to hear that, because it's a reminder that even as a pastor, there are places where I'm comfortable, but yet I'm not comfortable. And a part of that has to do with this idea that, again, there's been so much white majority culture associated with evangelicalism. And because I'm with you, I consider myself an evangelical as well. But at the same time, don't feel completely at home, because there is something about my Koreanness, my Asianness, that doesn't fully fit there. And I do think that that's, again, some of the uncomfortable things that we're beginning to really process through over the last year, in terms of, where's our place in this conversation? Where's our place in terms of how we understand our faith in light of, our Asianness, and even our gender, as Michelle was mentioning. I think we've been having these kinds of conversations throughout the pandemic because there have been so many issues that have risen up in the church, right? Like God is exposing our idols, exposing our sinfulness, and there's issues that we need to really work through. So I'm really grateful that you guys are bringing that up. And again, calling us to this idea that if full orb discipleship doesn't happen if we're not talking about these things and we're not working through this stuff. So really appreciate that. So I'll have one last question for you guys, which is actually with regards to what is our place in this conversation. Again, there's been so much racial tension in the United States over the last summer with the explosion of the BLM movement. And a lot of Asian leaders wanted to get involved, but we weren't fully comfortable engaging with the issue because we weren't sure where we fit into that particular conversation with the white and black dynamic. And so I'm wondering, how does this particular moment help us make sense of what our role is in the American church as a whole, as Asian Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. We as Asian American Christians actually have a lot to offer both the church and society at large. And in fact, I truly believe that the future of racial reconciliation and unity in this country hinges on the unique contribution of Asians and Asian Americans. And if you study the history of Asian American theology, you'll see over and again how Asian Americans are described as living in the in-between world, right? We're neither Asian nor American, but we're also in the in-both world. We're both Asian and American. And Vietnamese American Catholic theologian Peter C. Phan, he articulates that Asian Americans are betwixt and between, and this in-betweenness is actually our strength. As Asian American Christians, we know how to bring anyone and everyone to the table. We are bridge builders. For example, as Asian Americans, we lead in unique ways. We're often more silent. We wait for that pause, right? But these are all good things. We bring a culture of listening, and we pay attention to other people. Now, fully living this out will require us to lean into our cultural identities and our unique Asian American theology and our giftings. And we need to be proud of who God has made us as cultural beings. We also shouldn't be ashamed to associate with other Asian Americans, because too often, and as Ray mentioned too, we seek dominant culture approval and fear associating ourselves with fellow Asians. And like, many Asian American Christians have tried to be white proximate and think and act essentially like white conservative evangelicals. Ray and I, we had a AACC podcast episode recently with Dr. Sung-Chan Ra, who shared this quote: "God did not create Asians to be honorary white people." And I would add to that, God did not create Asian Christians to be honorary white Christians. And so, investing in our own cultural identity development, studying Asian American theology, and continuing to theologize ourselves and bringing our unique giftings with leadership capacities in the church are all ways that we will live out into our ability to bring racial reconciliation and unity within the spaces we inhabit.
Yeah, and I'd add, and that was interesting too for me, especially as I organized that march last year for Black Lives and Dignity. One of the things that because Asian American Christians have not been engaged in the race discussion by and large, they don't know where they fit. But like Michelle said, we have a rich history of participating in solidarity with other communities of color. It's a narrow and slim kind of history, but it's there. And what we're trying to do is kind of recover it and to kind of live back into it so that we don't lose it and allow kind of the broader white supremacist framework to shape and define who we actually are as Christians. It shouldn't matter what skin color someone is in order to care for them, in order to advocate for them, in order to join in to in any fight to kind of pursue their well-being, right? That shouldn't matter. But sadly, because of the racial framework that we live in, Asian Americans who don't understand race don't feel like they can navigate well inside it. And because Asian American Christians have generally been inactive, or Asian American Christians have generally been, especially churches, have not participated by simply showing up to already existing marches or rallies or protests where there are things that break God's heart are being identified and called out. I think that it has hindered our witness and has hindered our spiritual kind of spiritual formation to be able to engage in things that actually can make a difference, right? Just showing up to an event, right? It's not everything, but it is something. It gets noticed. It's one way of saying that we are here and we're going to make a stand by posting something on social media, right? Obviously, everything should be done out of love, and everything should be done, with grace. But posting something that's truthful on social media, it's an act of resistance, right? We're resisting the powers and principalities of darkness that are trying to perpetuate harm. And anytime we're able to do that, right, whether it's in private or in public, I think what ends up happening is that it shows that we don't have to be afraid of kind of being out there with the people. And I think one of the things that I loved about hearing, one of the things I heard the most after the Chicago March for Black Lives and Dignity last year was that many people went in afraid of what it might mean for them to be associated with a march. When they left, they were like, this was one of the most spiritually formative activities that I've ever done. I'm so glad I brought my children here. In fact, even now I'm getting text messages from people that said, that are saying in different cities, I'm taking my children. They're 5, 6, 7, 12, 15 years old. And I want them to be a part of this because I want this to be a part of their discipleship. And I wish that I had this as a part of my discipleship. And I'm learning it now. And so we should not be a light that's covered, by a bowl or a basket, but we should be a light that truly shines. We should be a city on a hill. And to be a city on a hill means that others are seeing and others are able to see because of us.
Yeah, that's wow. That's again so inspiring. Thinking about taking your kids. I'm old enough to remember the LA riots, and there was a Korean peace march that happened after the weeks of that particular event. And I remember I was late elementary school, and I remember our parents took us to that rally, and we didn't fully understand exactly what was happening, but it has left an indelible mark that like this is something that we do right when there's an injustice. One of my favorite memories from that event was just seeing other children and recognizing that like this was what it means to be Korean American right now, and this is what it's like to come together for this. And it wasn't actually just the Koreans that were marching. There was lots and lots of different kinds of people that were marching alongside us, and I do remember that. One thing that I reflected on, because there was a documentary called LA 92, and I didn't realize this because I was too young to remember this, but that documentary was so helpful in helping me see how the Asian Americans in that time frame, even considering what had happened to Koreatown specifically, the Korean American leaders at the end of that march actually apologized to the Black community and said like there were things that we did that were wrong, and we understand why you guys rioted. We understand why this happened, in the midst of lamenting over what had happened. And realizing that was super powerful because I didn't realize that had happened. And I think that's precisely where our voice is, recognizing that there have been injustices done. And yet at the same time, the gospel is big enough to help us to forgive one another and to move towards solidarity and unity. So yeah, thank you guys so much again for the work that you guys are doing. We are absolutely praying for you guys, and it's so encouraging to see the amount of this past week, just the amount of cities that have been joining in to these rallies. And there's definitely a sense, if you've been feeling like you haven't been seen, like in the midst of all of these conversations regarding race, to see all of these cities popping up again and again, and adding new cities day by day has been so encouraging, and realizing that there are so many of us that are willing to take a stand for this is so encouraging and unifying during a time when it feels so, politically divided and so racially divided. And so this is, again, the work that you guys are doing is so good for the kingdom, and we really, really appreciate you guys for that. So thank you, Raymond and Michelle, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if you're in the city and you're looking to join a rally, please check out the website, AACC, or Asian American Christian Collaborative.com. You'll be able to learn more there. There are 13 cities, and there might be more. We're in conversations with several other cities that are trying to scramble. Some are saying that they might be able to pull it off. Some are asking if they might be able to do it another week. And so we're wondering if we do a second wave of activities. We don't know. But also check out the resources that we have, the articles, and then the events, because we're going to continue to put out more and more events out, both virtually and in person.
Well, again, on behalf of the SOLA Network, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that this conversation has been fruitful. We want to encourage you towards prayer and action for taking a stand and getting involved. If you want to find out more about AACC, please visit their website at AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com and follow their social media on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, which we've all got linked below. All right, bye everyone.